In this video, we're going to cover the Resto Druid's single target and AoE healing strategies. Let's begin by examining the various healing spells for Resto Druids. You can see a list right now of the different categories of healing spells. Your normal heal as a Restoration Druid is Nourish. This is just a relatively slow cast that is very inexpensive. It also has a property of healing for more if you have a heal over time effect on the target, like Life Bloom or Wild Growth. Let's take a look at your main single target heal over time spells. Your main one is Rejuvenation. This is basically your bread and butter heal over time. Life Bloom is a special single target heal over time spell. You can cast it 3 times. It will stack 3 times on a single target, and it also ticks pretty fast. As you can see, I cast it on myself. See how rapidly it's ticking? It ticks a little bit faster than your Rejuvenation spell, so it's more effective at, say, stabilizing your tank because it has that constant flow of healing. The other property of Life Bloom is that you can only stack it up to 3 times on one target, unless you're in your Tree of Life form. Every healing class has a slow, inefficient, but powerful healing spell. For example, Resto Shamans have Greater Healing Wave. In this case, Resto Druids have Healing Touch, and this is, in my case, is a 2.41 second cast, and anytime you cast it, it will reduce any remaining cooldown on your Nature's Swiftness spell by 10 seconds. Regrowth is the Resto Druid's fast but inefficient heal. It's sort of like a Priest's flash heal spell, except that Regrowth has a heal over time effect. Let's move on to the Resto Druid AoE healing spells, starting with Wild Growth. Wild Growth is an instant cast AoE healing spell that will intelligently prioritize healing the most injured party members. Let's move on to Efflorescence. Again, coming back to our talent discussion, Efflorescence is not a standalone spell. Efflorescence is triggered anytime you cast Swiftmend. For example, you have to get a Rejuvenation dot up, then cast Swiftmend. That'll drop your Efflorescence AoE healing thing on the ground there, that green glowing surface. Anytime you stand inside of it, it'll heal you. Let's move on to the last AoE healing spell, that is Tranquility. This is a very powerful channeled AoE heal with a 3-minute cooldown. When you cast it, it does this really fancy graphic, and that's the way it looks. And that wraps up our Resto Druid AoE healing spells. Let's walk through a very high-level healing strategy algorithm. You can see the steps for that algorithm on the screen right now. The purpose of this algorithm is to emphasize the importance of Life Bloom and what are referred to as filler spells. The reason why it's so important to keep casting Life Bloom or to keep refreshing Life Bloom comes back to our talent discussion about Malfurion's Gift. As you recall, Malfurion's Gift gives your Life Bloom ticks a chance to cause Omen of Clarity, which is your clear casting buff, so it makes sense that the more often you have that Life Bloom ticking away, the greater the chances are that you'll have a clear cast buff. So coming back to the healing algorithm that you can see on the screen right now, you're really just alternating between either casting Life Bloom or refreshing Life Bloom, and in between your Life Bloom casts, you'll be making use of what are called filler casts. In the case of a single target healing strategy, the filler casts include Nourish, Rejuvenation, Regrowth, and Swiftmend. Those are all single target casts. This isn't really an order of priority. The choice of spell that you make at any given point is entirely dependent on what's going on in the pull at that time. Say, for example, you have 3 stacks of Life Bloom on your tank, but he's almost dead. In that case, you may cast Regrowth. Say, in another example, your tank has 3 stacks of Life Bloom, but he doesn't have a Rejuvenation hot. In that case, you may cast Rejuvenation, and you may follow it up with a Swiftmend. So it really depends on the situation. In the case of an AoE healing strategy, the spells you would use would include Wild Growth, Tranquility, and Efflorescence. Again, the choice of spell you use is entirely dependent on that situation. In a nutshell, all this healing strategy is saying is to make sure that you always keep 1 to 3 stacks of life bloom up on one target all of the time, and in between refreshing life bloom, intelligently choose the most appropriate filler spell that we just covered. Let's move on to some effective best practices for Resto Druids. Always try to keep your tank buffed with life bloom and rejuvenation. Ideally, you'll want to keep 3 stacks of life bloom up on the tank, and the reason why you want to keep rejuvenation up on the tank is so that you'll always be able to cast Swiftmen in the event that you need to cast an instant heal on the tank. Let's move on to the next best practice. Whenever you have a clear casting buff, either cast Regrowth or Healing Touch. The reason why is that both of these spells are very expensive. Regrowth is almost 6,000 mana, and Healing Touch is just over 5,000 mana. Both of them heal for quite a bit. There are different situations that call for casting Regrowth versus casting Healing Touch. If you need to heal your tank right away, then obviously you would cast Regrowth. If you have enough time to cast Healing Touch, then go ahead and cast Healing Touch during that clear casting buff. Let's move on to the next one. Utilize Nature's Swiftness for an emergency heal. This is a very, as we discussed in the talents discussion, Nature's Swiftness is a very nice emergency ability. Whenever you cast Nature's Swiftness, the next spell will be instant. The most logical choice for an instant heal would be a long cast that heals a lot, and that would be Healing Touch. So I'll target myself. Say, for example, I'm the tank, and I'm nearly dead. You can do this very quickly. Nature's Swiftness, Healing Touch. See that? That was like 1 second. I will usually do that if there isn't enough time to cast Rejuvenation followed by Swiftmen. In other words, if it's a very critical situation where he is just about to die, or another party member is. Let's move on to the next best practice. This one recommends saving Tree of Life casts for critical healing situations. It does have a 3-minute cooldown. It's a lot smarter to save Tree of Life for emergency situations, because if you look at what it does, it not only does it enhance a lot of your healing spells so that they're more powerful, they're instant in some cases, it also increases your defensive abilities. So if you're in a situation where everyone in your party is taking damage and it looks like you guys are about to wipe, and maybe you're taking damage too, in my opinion, that is usually the best case to pop Tree of Life versus just keeping Tree of Life on cooldown. Let's move on to our next best practice. This recommends buffing the tank with Thorns in AoE situations. The reason why this is beneficial comes to how Thorns works. If you look at the tooltip, Thorns is a buff that you can place on a friendly target that will cause nature damage to the attackers whenever they strike the friendly target. So it makes sense that in an AoE pull, that will help the tank hold aggro and keep aggro off you as a healer. Now, I actually make use of a macro that will automatically cast Thorns on whatever target has the focus. So if I zone into a dungeon, the first thing I'll do is set focus to the tank, and then if I'm in the middle of healing, in the middle of a pull or whatever, I don't have to target the tank in order to buff him with Thorns. I can just activate the macro. Let's move on. Know the benefits of repeatedly spamming direct heals on the tank. One reason why comes back to our Empowered Touch talent. The way this works is anytime you cast a direct heal on a target that has Life Bloom on it, the direct heal will refresh the duration of Life Bloom. So if you keep spamming direct heals, you won't have to cast Life Bloom on the target again. The other benefit of frequently casting direct healing spells comes back to our Mastery talent, Harmony. If you recall, the way Harmony works, anytime you cast a direct healing spell, it'll give you the Harmony buff that lasts 10 seconds, and it increases the periodic healing of your healing over time spells by 20%. Let's move on to our final best practice. This is sort of a general recommendation for all healers, not just Resto Druids. Consider letting noobs die in a fire. Let me expand on this for just a moment. Say you're healing a 5-man party and you're in the middle of a boss fight. And on this particular boss fight, the boss does things like creates massive fires that do tremendous damage if you stand in them. If you have a party member that is standing in fire and they're taking tremendous damage and it doesn't appear that they're going to make any effort whatsoever to run out of the fire, then don't waste cooldowns like Tree of Life and burn a bunch of mana trying to save them. If it looks like they're just standing there because they don't have a clue, you're better off to just let them die and save your cooldowns and your mana for people that know how to play. Now that we've covered the various healing strategies for Resto Druids, let's move on to a real-life example in the context of a 5-man dungeon.